Right. You mentioned something in passing there. You mentioned that she was pro-feminist government. I just want to get your opinion about that again. And in part is because we talked about something related to this the last time we talked, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. I know you have a very tough stance in court on such issues. But what do you think? I have actually been hearing on media that this is a fight of a woman versus man in office. So, what do you think this is? Being a woman, is it related to that? Do you think?
Well, I think the optics of it makes it look bad, right? And as I pointed out, he had a spat with his previous finance minister, Bill Morneau, and punted him
Right.
out of office in favor of Chrystia Freeland. I think it's the way. I mean, it's not that you can't demote people. He's demoted men as well as he's demoted women. I think this the way it's the positions that he elevates women to are so crucial and so high profile that it really becomes a much bigger issue when he does demote them. And it's not necessarily that they did something wrong. So let's recall the first time he had this problem was with Jody Wilson-Raybould, right? So she had done everything that he had asked her to do. She was working diligently on her files as Attorney General and as Minister of Justice. She did what they'd asked. She was fulfilling her mandate. The issue was she wasn't going to bend on a deferred prosecution for a particular firm's SNC at Lavalin, and he tried to pressure her to do that. She said, I can't do that in good conscience because I don't think that they fulfill the need for it, and I'm not going to do that. She's pressured and all that, and so he says, you're out, you go away. And so he's interfered with the actual work of the Attorney General. The Minister of Justice sits in cabinet, but the Attorney General doesn't, so it's a kind of an awkward thing. So on that one, for sure, he was offside, and it sort of ruined his credibility there. And then with Chrystia Freeland, again, he mismanaged her. Like, it's one thing to demote her, but it's so humiliating to expect her to know that she is fired from a job on Friday, but to show up on work on Monday and go in front of the cameras, go to the House of Commons, and have this full-throated endorsement of a plan that you disagree. And so that, I think, I really wonder if he would have treated Bill Morneau that way. Would he have given him the heads up, or would he have had the expectation that Morneau do that kind of thing? And so I think that's where his sort of credibility as this pro-feminist prime minister falls short. But again, you could argue he's fired more men than he's fired women. But it becomes symbolic, and it becomes even more symbolic in light of the fact that a week previously he gives a speech and he complains that the Americans are anti-feminist and they push back women's rights by voting in Donald Trump. It's like, what are you thinking? Like, you're going to be shuffling out your finance minister. You're going to have a potential trade war with the Americans, and you use that as some sort of this mechanism to show that you are a strong feminist. It falls short. It seems contradictory, and so he's opened himself up to even more criticism.
Right. Yeah, and personally, I don't think everything has to be in the light of men versus women. Just like you were talking about the last time, it doesn't have to be in the light of being white versus being black or racially marginalized in society. So I don't think it's a clear position, to say the least, whether this is being a woman related or not. But I think only Chrystia Freeland would be able to tell us for real what that looks like, I guess, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I've always been skeptical about this whole, we must have gender parity in cabinet. I think I get frustrated, as we've talked about before, I'm sort of frustrated with tokens and with quotas. I would never want to be a person who was hired for a job only because of my gender. I find that rather insulting. So why wouldn't it be the case that if he had more women than men that are qualified, that he'd have more women than men in his cabinet, right? Or equally the other way around. It should be about qualifications rather than about gender. Gender is just one part of us, but it shouldn't be the defining factor. So the problem is, he has set up the frame. He set up a way for us to judge him, and he's saying, I want to be judged as a feminist. And so every decision he makes then becomes part of that narrative. And so when he goes against his so-called feminist credentials, he's opening himself for more criticism.
Well, I think even from the start of this administration in 2015, he touted himself as being a pro-women, in that he had the most number of women in this cabinet. But I think the argument on the other side of this conversation would be, people will say that women are already underrepresented underrepresented in cabinets in the past. So maybe there is a reason now to want to hire people based on their gender. Do you think underrepresentation is enough a fact for such?
No, I don't, because the issue is you got to look at what your population is vis-a-vis your choices to make for that cabinet. And the problem remains that fewer women than men put themselves out for elected office, even though they had more women than ever before, than any other party elected. The fact remains there are still more men elected in that caucus than there are women. So they are elevating a smaller pool. So you got to look at what is your base and even do it as a percentage of that. If it's 40-60, then have 40% women in your cabinet to reflect your overall caucus, rather than have this self-imposed of 50-50 thing. That shouldn't be the only consideration. And I know he's just had another cabinet shuffle and he's maintained that. That is his commitment, which I guess is fine. But then it does, you just sort of wonder when you look at other competent people in the cabinet who don't fit a gender stereotype, or they don't fit a visible minority stereotype, but they're extremely competent, really bright, could bring a lot to the table, that they're passed over. So those are things that you have to be mindful of, because some of these cabinet ministers have been rather underperforming, and you sort of wonder how they got that elevated position, given that they didn't necessarily do very well in their previous positions.
So would you be up for reducing the size of federal bureau, just like we have on the other side of the border right now?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of really good research about the number of people in your cabinet and the pressures on increased spending. And so the smaller your cabinet, the fewer pressures you have to satisfy the needs of the people around that cabinet table. We have exceptionally large cabinets for a country our size. I mean, we have ministers of seniors, minister of housing, transport. I mean, they just keep on adding and adding, adding. So I would suggest that the new prime minister, when that happens, comes in to really greatly reduce the number of members of cabinet, because it makes it that much easier to really focus on your core business, to focus on the areas that need funding, and to be able to cut a lot of the excess spending. We have a lot of waste in our spending, and I think it is related to the fact that we have so many cabinet ministers, because cabinet ministers it's not necessarily that their office costs a lot of money, it's that their asks always cost a lot of money, because every cabinet minister is going to say, well, I've got to show that I can produce and I can get something for my position, and so they're always going to ask for more money from the federal government, which we can ill afford right now.
Right. I think, in my opinion, the first cabinet member or the office that I would scrap would be the office of the Housing, Diversity and Inclusion. First, I don't know how those combine together, and I don't see what that office has achieved for Canada in the last so many years either.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that, and that will be the first office I will get rid of if I were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The analytics on this channel show about 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. So you do me a favor by clicking the subscribe button right now. Then I'll keep my promise to continually improve on the quality of the conversations that are produced on this channel every time.